This is Math Man Eddie back with another topic from a standard Statistics 1 course. And this video is devoted to the empirical rule. In here we'll talk about the empirical rule and what it means. And then also we'll do an example to find what percent of the data falls within certain intervals. So let's take a look at this. Now, the empirical rule says that for a bell-shaped set of data, and it tells us approximately what percent of the data will fall within certain intervals. For example, this says 68% of the data values will be within 1 standard deviation of the mean. 95% of the values will be within 2 standard deviations of the mean, and almost all the data should fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. Let's take a look at a picture that might help us with this. Now, when we're talking about the intervals are mu plus or minus 1 sigma, the mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation, plus or minus 2 standard deviations, and plus or minus 3 standard deviations. So we have a picture that looks like this, where we have a bell-shaped set of data. The mean is mu, and we mark off mu plus 1 standard deviation, 2 and 3 on the right-hand side, and mu minus 1 standard deviation, minus 2 standard deviations, minus 3 standard deviations on the left side. So what the empirical rule is saying is that if we mark off an interval that looks like this, approximately 68% of the data will fall in that interval. And if we mark off an interval that is 2 standard deviations to the left and right, then the empirical rule is saying that approximately 95% of the data values will be between this value and this value. And the last part of the empirical rule says if we mark off plus or minus 3 standard deviations, that creates an interval, and almost all of the data will fall in that interval. Now, I want to take and look at an example and see what these numbers look like. So the example we have is about IQ scores. And let's assume that the mean of all IQ scores is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. So what we have is a bell-shaped distribution. The mean is 100, and I've marked off the plus 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, and 3 standard deviations to the right, and the same thing to the left. Now, for our example, our first question is, or first requirement is, to find the percent of the IQ scores that would be between 85 and 115. Now, what we could do is mark off on our diagram 85 to 115, and the answer to this is 68%, because that's what the empirical rule says. So for this first question, approximately 68%. Now, the second question is this: find the percent of the IQ scores between 85 and 130. So, on our diagram, we already have a line at 85. Let's draw one at 130. And here we notice that this interval includes the 68%, plus it also includes the percent of the data values that would fall in here. So our answer here is going to be 68% plus whatever this is. Now, what percent of the data falls between 115 and 130? So to answer that, we're going to make another line here at 70, and we do know that between 70 and 130, according to the empirical rule, about 95% of the data values will fall in that interval. So we have a little problem here that has some symmetry, and we might have to use some arithmetic. But basically, if there's 95% between 70 and 130, 68% between 85 and 115, if we subtract 98 take away 60, 95 take away 68, we get 27%. Now that 27% is split evenly between this right here and on the right side right here. So it looks like we need to take 27 divided by 2, and that would give us 13.5%, and that represents the percent of the data values that would be between 115 and 130. So to finish this off, we want to know between 85 and 130. Well, 85 up to 115 is 68%. And we have 13.5% between 115 and 130. So we should add those together, and that gives us a total of 81.5%. So that would be the answer to the second question. Now we do have one more question here, and that is to find the percent of the IQ scores above 130. So we have to go back to our diagram, and on the diagram we notice that 95% of the values are between here and here. That only leaves 5% of the values left over. And this 5% of the data values would have to fall in this interval and this interval. And since we have symmetry, it looks like we have to take 5 divided by 2. And so we have about 2.5% of the data values would be in this region here, between 130 and 145, and between 55 and 70. Now this says to find the percent IQ scores above 130, and basically we've got almost all the percentages included here. So above 130 would be 2.5%. Now I have another example I'd like to take a look at. And this problem here says we have some data values from a sample, and we have 24 pieces of data, and the question is, what percent of our data values for the whole population would be in the following intervals? And so here we have our x bar, plus or minus 1 standard deviation, plus or minus 2, and plus or minus 3. So let's see, how do we do this? Now, in order to do this, we need to know what the mean and standard deviation are. And if we use a calculator or Excel, we can figure out that x bar is 80.8 and the standard deviation is 12.96. So let's take a look at that first interval, x bar plus or minus 1 standard deviation. Now that would be 80.8 plus or minus standard deviation. That gives us an interval that looks like this. And then what we do is we go up into our data and we count how many data values are between these two values. And we find out that there's 18 out of 24. We have 75% of our data values within 1 standard deviation of the mean. Now, what percent of the data values are in the interval x bar plus or minus 2 standard deviations? We'll take the mean plus 2 standard deviations. That gives us this interval. And then we look at our data and we notice that 23 out of 24 values, or 95.8% of the values, are in this interval. And finally, x bar plus or minus 3 standard deviations. This time we have 80.8 plus or minus 3 standard deviations gives us a new interval. And we also notice that 23 out of 24, or 95.8% of our values, are in that interval. So let's summarize what we just did here and compare against what the empirical rule says. So we know the empirical rule says that there should be 68%, 95%, almost all. Now, what do we get for our data? We got 75% of our data within the first standard deviation. That's a little bit high compared to the empirical rule. We got 95.8 within 2 standard deviations of the middle. That's about right on with the empirical rule. And we also have 95.8% within 3 standard deviations, and that's a little bit low compared to what the empirical rule says. So our set of data doesn't follow the empirical rule totally, which might mean that perhaps our set of data isn't really bell-shaped. And that concludes that example, and we're signing off on this video. Look forward to other videos on specific topics in Statistics 1.